water, earth, fire, air. Long ago, the world was believed by scholars to be entirely made up of these four elements. But this all changed as new evidence was uncovered which changed our understanding. Good evening, travelers. My name is Anunnaki, and in tonight's Spook Stop, we're going to take a look at the classical elements to see what they are, who came up with them, and how they became obsolete. So, I imagine most of you watching probably already had a decent idea of what the elements are, even before I briefly mentioned them in the opening. But what exactly were they? Well, as far back as ancient Greece, at least 500 BCE in fact, there arose an idea known as atomism, the idea that everything we see around us was made of something so small it couldn't be divided into anything any smaller. This is where we get the modern word atom, literally indivisible. Over time, it became accepted that everything could be separated into four basic categories, which went on to define the elements that supposedly made up everything. The Greeks weren't the only ancient culture to come up with this idea. Egypt, Persia, Babylonia, Japan, Tibet, and India all similarly followed the four-element hierarchy, sometimes including a fifth element, which I'll cover in a little bit. To the Greeks, the four classical elements were as follows. Earth, called Terra originally, made up all solid and unchanging matter. Water, called Aqua originally, made up all liquid and fluid matter, stuff which underwent frequent change but occasionally settled down. Air made up all gases and vapors. It underwent constant change without ever settling down. Before the idea of elements, it was common for invisible air to simply be thought of as nothingness, not made up of anything. Finally, fire, called ignis originally, of course made up all flames as well as all other forms of heat. So fleeting and ever-changing, it would eventually snuff itself out. So, for an example of this thinking in practice, one could look at a living animal and see their flesh as earth, blood and fluids as water, breath as air, and body heat as fire, albeit all in heavily modified forms. For this reason, some at the time believed that you could combine the pure forms of these elements in a lab setting to create an artificial life form. See my previous video on the homunculus for more on that. In addition to these four, there's sometimes an extra. Ether, sometimes called quintessence, it was believed to be the matter that filled the sky, or rather, outer space and everything in it. When it was originally believed that the world was the center of the universe, philosophers postulated that the world is likely a sphere of many different layers that occasionally intersected but generally remained in their own sections. Earth was of course the bottom layer, acting as the solid core of everything. On top of it rested the seas, above those were the clouds, and above the clouds was the sun, acting as a layer of fire. It was noted that the stars in the night sky, however, didn't undergo significant change like the other layers appeared to. The only conclusion that fit this model was that they were made of something else, something totally unchanging. Thus, ether was added to the roster. For other cultures, it was not uncommon to see void or nothingness appear as a fifth element, especially for those who understood it to be different from air. This is a little bit of a tangent, but I'd like to briefly talk about a more divergent idea of elements that comes from ancient China, the concept of Wu Jing, or the 5 phases. Where the earlier mentioned groups typically arranged the four elements like a sort of spectrum that things could be placed somewhere within, Wu Jing depicts the elements as being part of a continuous cycle of phases or stages that helps itself in one direction and harms itself in another. The 5 phases were fire, water, wood, metal, and earth. Wood is used as fuel to create fire. Fire then creates earth through the form of ashes it leaves behind. From earth we harvest ores and minerals, which creates metal. With metal we create containers that collect water. And finally, with said water, we grow plants to create more wood. This is called the cycle of generation, where each phase directly feeds into another. Alternatively, these phases can be used to destroy one another, called the cycle of conquering. Wood destroys earth, as growing roots can split rocks in two, and over-farming depletes the soil of nutrients. Earth can create dams or obstruct waterways, as well as simply absorb spilled water. Water, of course, extinguishes fire, fire melts and warps metal, and finally metal tools like axes and saws cut through trees. There's more interactions to be noted if you follow these arrows in the opposite directions, but I think you get the idea. I find it quite fascinating how elaborate the system of Wu Jing is, especially when compared to the rather linear spectrum the Greeks used. It's noteworthy that Pokemon, a Japanese series, features type relations that resemble Wu Jing. Meanwhile, Avatar, a Western series, still uses the four elements in about the same way the ancient Greeks had. On November 6, 1919, scientists from the Royal Society of London and the Royal Astronomical Society met to discuss the results of an experiment which would prove Einstein's theory of relativity. On passing a portrait of Isaac Newton, one turned and said, "Your world is about to be overthrown." One of the most important aspects of science is how information is able to be updated and changed as new things are learned and discovered, building itself up by standing on the shoulders of giants. It is important, therefore, to consider that no great thinker has ever known the true answers to the mysteries of our world. Every new answer spawns more questions, revelations scratching the surface of even greater mysteries. But of course, we don't shun great minds like Einstein or Isaac Newton for having incomplete pictures. While they receive justified recognition for their brilliance, there are many other great minds who go unspoken of in history classes. In some previous videos, I've touched upon a couple examples, such as Paracelsus and Franz Mesmer, whose entire bodies of work are cast aside simply because they spent their studies in fields that have been rendered obsolete in modern science. I'd like to highlight the works of one such mind, a philosopher named Empedocles. You might know him as the guy who came up with the four classical elements. Other philosophers before had proposed the existence of an arche, or first principle, from which everything derived. Examples included water and air as likely candidates. But it was Empedocles who believed there were multiple elements which combined together: fire, air, water, and earth. These are what Empedocles believed everything consisted of, calling them roots. Inspired by Empedocles' work, Plato would go on to coin the term elements. His first major contribution to the study of elements was proving that air was indeed a real physical thing instead of just nothingness. What he did was lower a bucket upside down into a body of water. As the bucket trapped a pocket of air inside instead of instantly filling up, this was taken as proof that air had substance to it. Something you might have noticed is how the four elements actually closely parallel the four basic states of matter: solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. As it turns out, this wasn't the only time Empedocles was kind of on the right track. A lot of his ideas seem to closely mirror modern scientific concepts. In addition to the elements, he also conceived the idea of invisible forces that directly act upon these elements to cause change. In the modern day, we know of four fundamental forces: gravity, magnetism, strong nuclear force, and weak nuclear force. But to Empedocles, there were only two: love and strife. Love was the force that brought things together, while strife caused things to separate. These two forces explain the natural variation and disorder among the elements, and why the world appeared to be a bit of everything all mixed together. And these weren't just like figurative ideas. He seriously viewed them as physical traits, where love was equal to the size of a given object, while strife was equal to an object's weight. So, in a weird sort of way, he was on the right track, with an object's mass directly influencing its gravity on other objects. This notion actually went a step further to suggest that the universe worked with a cosmic cycle where the two forces would overtake one another, causing the universe to come together and split apart over and over again, with life only being possible during the middle phases of this struggle. This has been termed the sphere of Empedocles, and served as his own personal interpretation for what God was. While certainly a little off in the physics department, it's very interesting to note that this idea of a cyclical universe is paralleled today with one of the leading theories about the Big Bang. It's been put forth that as the universe expands, it will reach a limit before starting to contract, eventually shrinking back down to a single point before expanding again into another Big Bang. This theory is known today as the Big Crunch. In addition to explaining how the four elements functioned mechanically, Empedocles also believed this explained how all life ended up the way it is today, albeit a little crudely. Empedocles put forth that at the beginning of each cycle, when the elements would start to settle and form basic things, there would emerge life. But this early life was quite bizarre. First to form would be organs and body parts, disembodied and unarranged. Like the random shuffling of cards, they would come together and form the first animals. However, of course, they would be totally random. Creatures with many limbs or multiple heads, or traits of man and beast combined. These nonsensical combinations would not survive their initial creation, and instead be overtaken by the normal creatures. This might sound like natural selection, an idea put forth by Charles Darwin almost 2,000 years later. This is not to say Empedocles truly understood evolution. Rather, he understood that poorly suited organisms would probably die out and leave only the strongest in their place, and it was for this reason that we don't see any animals with 2 heads or 10 legs. This hardly has anything to do with elements at this point, but I'd be remiss if I didn't briefly mention the bizarre tales of how Empedocles met his end. Firstly, it's debated just how old he even was, with some claiming he only lived to be 60, while others claimed he reached the age of 109. According to one legend, he was able to achieve enlightenment and one night ascended to heaven to become a literal god without ever dying. A more popular idea is that he committed suicide by jumping into Mount Etna, an active volcano on the coast of Italy. The reasons for this vary, but most agreed he believed this would somehow result in him achieving godhood. Some writers go so far as to say the moment he jumped, the volcano erupted and sent his mortal body skyward to the heavens, making his plan come true. Whatever happened, Empedocles was either very troubled, very intelligent, or very crazy. The late 8th century saw the rise of Arabian alchemist Jabir ibn Hayyan, who took great interest in the classical elements of the Greeks and decided to order them based on some fundamental qualities: hot, cold, dry, and wet. This was seen as the first major step in understanding how the 4 elements worked and interacted, and it was put forth that if one could alter the properties of a given element, they could transmute it from one into another. The first major application of this was attempting to turn lead, which was believed to be cold and dry, into gold by changing its properties to instead be hot and wet. This would prove to be a fruitless endeavor, which Jabir believed was the result of the 4-element model being insufficient. To this end, he came up with 2 new elements he believed to work a little differently: sulfur, which allowed things to burn, and mercury, which allowed things to combine or separate. Soon, a 3rd new element was added: salt, which instead caused things to resist change. Swiss alchemist Paracelsus classed these 3 as the tria prima, or 3 primes, and arranged them separately from the 4 base elements. Alchemy wasn't the only new branch of science taking the world by storm. In the Age of Enlightenment, there were many new booming fields, such as medicine, biology, and most important for this section, astronomy. For hundreds of years, people had been looking up at the night sky and charting what they saw, and by this point in time, there were some agreed upon heavenly bodies. Known as the 7 sacred luminaries, they were the celestial bodies visible to the naked eye, later called wandering stars or wanderers, before finally being called planets. They consisted of the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. I bring these up because for the world of alchemy they would spark a big change. Rather than simply seeing them as all composed of ether like before, The existence of the Tria Prima led some to speculate that celestial bodies might be the pure forms of even more unique elements. This gave us the planetary metals: gold for the Sun, silver for the Moon, tin for Jupiter, iron for Mars, copper for Venus, lead for Saturn, and of course, mercury for Mercury. So our element count went from 4 to 5 to 8 before finally jumping to 15. This count kept climbing, as soon the mundane elements began to be added, such as phosphorus, zinc, lithium, and many more. At this point, the list of elements should be looking a little familiar. I'll close this off where it enters into the modern day, as this is about where it picks up when it's taught about in high school. In the year 1869, Russian chemist Dmitry Mendeleev compiled a list of 66 elements and arranged them on a table based on their weight and chemical similarities, formulating periodic law and establishing what we know today as the periodic table of elements. The ancient study of alchemy evolved into the modern field of chemistry. As of the making of this video, there are 118 elements, but to frame it in the mindset of the ancient Greeks, we now believe the entire world around us, including the stars in the night sky, to be composed of 94 naturally occurring elements. A far cry from the original 4, but it's the closest we've come to the truth so far. I hope you all enjoyed the episode. If you did, then please be sure to like and subscribe, as well as hit that bell so you don't miss future uploads. If you have any ideas for future episodes you'd like me to do, let me know in the comments below. Until next time, this has been Zenonaki, and I'll be seeing you all again very soon.